Welcome to part 2 of the Ogroid Myrmidon Masterclass. Today I'm going to show you how I painted the skin tones. While this video is about how I painted the skin tones, we are also going to include a few general topics. I want to focus on how to create a large variety of shades in the skin tones with a minimum of colors. This means we will do some color mixing, but since we are using very few base colors, it also means we will not have many complicated mixes, and we will always be able to come back to different parts later and work on them, while we still can create an interesting variety. For example, the tail is not really finished right now, we will come back to it later. We're going to explore the importance of isolating and defining individual shapes and volumes of a sculpt and how it influences the techniques we use. It's important to adapt the paint consistency to the end result you want, so we are going to give this a closer look. And finally, we want to embrace brush strokes and texturing. All of these concepts underlie my painting and they need to be addressed in an educational video like this. However, each of these could be extended to hour-long videos. More than is viable for a video like this. If you're interested in diving deeper into these concepts, you can do so by joining my Patreon campaign. There's hundreds of videos and PDFs that cover all these topics. Last but not least, follow my Instagram for regular updates on the project and post your progress pictures under the hashtag on screen. Remember, the goal of this series is to learn and to have fun. Before we start, here's a list of the colors that I used in this video. I primed the miniature black. Pre-shading by priming black and white only makes sense if you intend to take advantage of the value differences by using transparent colors, for example. But I don't want to do any of that, so black is fine. If you want to get an idea for how your miniature catches light, prime the black and white, or prime the black and put it under a lamp to understand the light situation. But in any case, you need to take a picture for later reference if you intend to use opaque colors, because when you start to paint, you cover everything anyway. I'm base coating the skin with a mix of Mephiston Red and Pink Horror. This gives an intense and saturated base color to work with. I'm using an old brush here to apply 2 or 3 layers of color in a creamy consistency until everything is properly covered. I put orange brown and clear orange on my palette and mixed them both to find a nice highlight color. However, ignore the clear orange. I ended up using orange brown only because it didn't make much of a difference. Painting is an evolving process and you cannot know everything up front, so when you are applying the paint, sometimes we have to change things to achieve what we want. So I'm applying a few transparent layers here to see how the two colors interact. You can already see that I intend to have the pink base color shine through in the shadows when you look at where I'm applying the layers of orange. It's going to take a few layers until the orange color covers completely, and we can use the transparency to our advantage and have the pink base color shine through where we want to. If you're wondering about the consistency, it's somewhere between a glaze and a layer thickness. The plan is to cover most of the body in orange with the pink still shining through in certain areas to draw the upper body and the lower body together. I filmed a segment where I'm explaining why I chose the colors I'm using. Unfortunately, from looking at my analytics, people typically click away or skip these in-depth explanations. And frankly, this masterclass series is taking more time than I anticipated and I need Patreon content too. So I took the segment out of the video and it is available on my Patreon and for YouTube channel members. So making use of the transparency of the paint, I'm applying layers of the orange. Applying less layers where I want the pink to shine through, and more layers where I want the orange to be opaque. Just study how I apply the paint on the neck, for example, and which areas I cover and which I leave out. Remember, it's important to adapt the properties of our paint and the way we apply it to what we want to achieve. This is a good exercise for mixing a color consistency that covers just enough to leave a consistent layer, but still allows for transparency on edges. We can also practice how we need to hold the brush for applying these layers and how we need to adapt the application to different shapes. Like on these smaller volumes, it's a more dabbing motion, while on these longer, flat shapes, we need to move the brush in a line motion. And on these flat surfaces, we can just use the broad side of the tip of the brush to drag pigment over the whole surface more evenly. I also approach the face in a similar way, but we're going to learn how to do the face in the next video. And let's focus on the general skin tones in this one. Now let's get into defining shapes of a miniature. The chest muscle relatively to our zenithal global light source will mostly catch a lot of light. See how I'm defining the whole area, and I pay extra attention to where the chest muscle integrates with the shoulder muscle. That whole area catches light because it has the shape of a plane and needs to be highlighted accordingly. While the shoulder muscles are spherical and curve down where they meet the chest muscle, so we are fine putting a shade there. Always treat the shapes separately and define each of them one by one. The way I'm moving my brush is what I consider a sketching style, but taking advantage of transparent paint. Again, don't get too stuck in techniques, just study how I apply the paint and how I move my brush while I define the shapes. It will make more sense once we get to the parts where I start to highlight. We're dealing with different shapes. The shape of the shoulder muscle is different from the shape of the squeezed neck muscles, and the flat neck area and even the neck area that curves down are different. I was slowly starting to develop the transition of the saturated orange skin color into the darker desaturated leg areas. So what I did here was to mix a bit of orange brown and the base mix, and I'm fading that out to have a gradient from pure orange to the base pink. Once everything was covered by the first layer of orange, I added a second layer, and again this is mainly to build the main colors with the pink still being present and increasing desaturation. People that previewed the footage said that maybe the pink step would not be necessary, but I disagree, since the color variety within the orange with the pink below cannot be denied. If you're one of the skeptics, feel free to try without the pink base coat. So the next layers build up more opacity, and you can see that I'm covering less area and leave the shades with a bit of pink still shining through. And I clean up the areas, especially these planes that border on other shapes or have sharp edges with shadows next to them, like these strains of the neck muscles. And here you can see what I mean with cleanup. Using transparent paint with some of the lower color shining through also works pretty well for areas like the hands. I'm putting paint on the knuckles and I'll leave the in-between parts pink. You can see that the pink creates a shadow, and it also feels like there is some more blood vessels shining through the thinner skin here. I already mentioned that I would classify my style of painting as a sketching style, but there is variations of that. Some people like to build up the highlights with only a few layers. Personally, I like to use more in-between color mixes for a bit of a smoother result. This is totally up to you. Neither style is better or worse, it's just different and personal preference. As you can see, I'm putting on opaque layers with a highlight color mix of orange, brown and ice yellow where I want the highlights to be. It doesn't make sense to glaze up 3 or 4 layers until I have the same opacity. Instead, I'm putting down these layers that are opaque right away, and I work on the transitions as a second step, as you're going to see in a bit. Again, it's important to analyze each shape and decide where the highlights would be brightest accordingly. So we already mentioned 2 of the principles we are going to look at in this video. The first is defining shapes, the second is varying opaqueness of a color, and another one is texture and how we apply our brush strokes. My brush strokes are dynamic and always adapt to the area I'm working on. Here on the back, I align them in an angle that I believe would make sense as that direction fur would grow in. On the other side, I define the highlights, again aligning my brush strokes in a direction that will allow the eye to interpret this as fur growth. No need to blend this super smoothly. The overlap of darker base tone and brighter brush strokes we achieved through using less diluted paint looks like natural hair texture. From now on, I switch between a few tasks, and you're going to see this repeatedly, but that's fine, and I'm always going to call it out because repetition is the way to learn things. First, I use opaque layers of building highlights, like on this chest muscle that's divided into smaller linear shapes and larger shapes that allow for a bit of interpretation and actually need a bit more painted detail to not look boring. For example, this deltoid. You see that my brushstrokes leave a few in between darker areas, which leads us to second, I use opaque brushstrokes that overlap with darker areas to build texture. And third, I'm working on transitions between the darker areas and the first highlights. I use a combination of a little more transparent mixes and stippling, like on the lower arm, and then switching to the deltoid. On round shapes like on the back, I make sure that the global light is brighter on the upper areas, applying an evenly opaque layer of color. I'm gradually adding more ICL to the mix, and I continue applying the same principles, defining edges and shapes and building texture. At this point, my focus is more on the brushstroke direction and on stippling, covering less area to build more highlights. It's also important to define all edges facing up. While we are trying to find the right way to highlight all shapes, we can apply paint more conservatively. Here I'm testing how the highlights look, how much they desaturate the overall appearance of the orange, and I start with less wider areas that I can always extend and make wider if I have to. Also, I'm applying these highlights to all volumes. Then I stop and re-evaluate and adapt if I have to. We will define the deeper parts of these cuttings in a later video, but in this stage I'm also making sure all edges that face up are brighter as they would catch more light. And I'm also pronouncing the veins of the biceps, because of the same principle. At this point I wanted to also bring the lower part of the model, aka the legs, up to the same definition. For that I need a highlight color, so I'm preparing a base mix again, and I'm mixing in a bit of orange brown like before, and I add ice yellow to make the color brighter. I did not have a clear vision how I would continue here, but don't forget, painting is always evolving and changing, and my idea was to highlight all of the legs. So I started to make the kneecap brighter as well as the upper leg, using the same sketching opaque brushstrokes to define the initial important shapes. I thought I would also highlight these lower parts, but I ended up doing something different. So no need to talk about this. Just leave them the way they are if you're painting along, but definitely define the muscles of the upper leg with the first highlight. I also applied this highlight color on the butt cheeks, and I built basic volume highlights on the legs. Remember, more is needed because the legs will be black and we will have to redefine most of it under that premise. I'm adding a little more orange to the mix to unify the more orange upper part and the pink area under the belt. Just adding layers of paint over the specific areas to blend the two different colors together. Just a hint of orange in the lower part and the hint of pink in the upper area unifies it nicely. And I'm doing the same on the front of the leg. I'm putting in more highlights on the orange parts to create the contrast we need. Using ice yellow, I'm starting to apply small highlights. We don't want to cover too much space here, just adding these precise highlights because it's easy to overdo this step. So make sure not to cover the gradients you built up before. I switched to stippling for these highlights a lot because it allows for these small but opaque highlights, and since we already applied texture in the previous layers, this blends right in. Part of this step is defining the separations of our shapes, so the first thing I do is putting in these lines, like on the chest muscle. You see me doing that up here where the deltoid muscles have a flat area in between. It's a flat area, it would catch light, it gets a highlight. Don't forget, we are free to put our own interpretation into any sculpt. Really look for the patterns I do. It's similar steps all the time, and most of them are aimed at building contrast. Gradually adding more ice yellow and defining even slimmer highlight areas. Just dabbing on color and then smoothing out edges that were too harsh with stippling or more transparent layers. I'll show you a bit of footage where I do these steps on different shapes. Since I wanted the feet to be black and contrasting against the saturated upper body to draw less attention, I was applying opaque layers of paint on the lower parts and then more transparent layers the further I moved up, so I could have a transition of black to pink and then up to the orange. It's okay to define the shadow areas with more black because they're darker anyway. Whenever I mix colors for situations like this, I add a little of the base color, so the two colors are a bit more equal and transitions will be less harsh. So here I'm using a mix of the base color of Mephiston red and pink coral mixed with black and some dark sea blue to have some blue in the shadows too. This results in more of a gray color than actual black. The challenge here is to blend together the upper legs and the lower legs so everything fades to black. And yes, of course we could start black from the feet up and try to blend in the orange pink, but again, sometimes you will decide to change an element while you paint, and I think it's neat to see this type of blending with darker layers over brighter ones in a video too. After all, we're here to learn things. You can see that I still want some color variation, so around the knee I'm adding a lot of Mephiston red to the mix and then adding more Screamer pink to mix an in-between color that I can dab on to make a transition, as you can see on the kneecap, and then all the transition areas. So like I said, it's fine to put down opaque layers in the dark areas and further down areas, and then use more transparent layers and in-between mixes on the transitions. I'm using this in-between color mix to smooth out transitions and adding opaque layers to define shapes that catch more light. For example, any hard planes like these leg muscles and spheres that face up like the calves. And you can see how I mix in more of the highlight color I used for the upper leg the further I go towards these colors, so everything blends together nicely. We don't need to have this exact highlight color, our best approximation will do. This is a good exercise of trying to recreate the color we used, which is again a very empowering thing because it gives you a skill that you can work with. It also makes you less afraid of using the wrong color. I want you to see that none of this fits the traditional categories of glazing or washing and so on. What I do is preparing paint and applying it to where I needed to go and to do what I wanted to do. Thinking outside these categories and thinking more solution oriented will give you the confidence and tools to deal with all situations and make you an accomplished painter. I'm applying some pure Mephiston red to the knee area because, again, I want the color variation in here in order to not make this area too boring. I just apply solid layers of color and then go back to an in-between mix and rebuild the transition by dabbing on color on the harsher edges. And I'm adding more red where I felt like I lost some intensity. We will detail this area more later. Going back to my dark gray mix, I make sure that I have an even layer to work off of. Going back to my dark gray mix, I make sure that I have an even layer to work off of. I'm also pulling it up further into the pink areas, and yes, I'm working over some areas that I invested time into earlier. I envy people that have it all figured out before they start painting. I don't, and I will often adjust on the fly, but that's fine, and it's part of the fun for me. Notice how I push the pigments down into the darker areas while I'm applying the paint. That will help to create the gradient immediately. You can also see that my layers are rather transparent, and I'm going over the areas several times to make them gradually darker and darker. What I'm doing is I'm adjusting the color to what is needed. I can't stress that enough. Doing this gradual shading allows for controlling where the gradient goes, where it starts to get darker, and where I keep my brighter color. It takes some time, but it's very controlled, and we can always mix an in-between color and smooth parts out even more. Then I proceed to highlight the black parts. You can see on the palette that I'm mixing a bit of black into the highlight color I used for the upper parts of the leg, which gives us a nuanced gray that fits with the rest of the colors. I don't want to introduce any more colors at this point, and in general, I will limit the colors I use on a project and just mix highlight colors from what I already have on the palette. I keep defining all shapes using the brush motions I used before, stippling, dabbing, line sketching, and I build the highlights up gradually. I always keep an open eye for areas that can be adjusted, and here I noticed that some transitions were a little rough, which can be harmonized by adding very thin glazes of color over the whole area. In this case, I also wanted to make the brighter leg areas darker too, in order not to draw too much attention. On the back, I mixed an in-between color to blend the brighter areas into the dark parts. Then I'm going back to the knee. I decided that I want additional detail here, so I'm working in lines. I decided to have a bright vertical line of culminating light dots on the right side and thin lines running across horizontally. You can see on the palette I used a rather light mix of pink that I already had on the palette, an ice yellow, and I'm just painting everything in a very opaque manner. Again, as this evolves, I feel like I want this part to be a bit brighter as a whole, to have a bit of a detail in a really dark area. So I'm working over this with a darker red-orange mix, which ties everything together again and tones down the lines. I leave some of the red shining through in the deeper areas that separate the kneecap from the rest of the leg. And using this mix, I'm painting in more lines around the knee, adding more detail and interest. But I still wasn't happy about the brightness in this area, so I'm going brighter with a few more layers. Notice that the lines, however, are still shining through. Also notice how we basically mix the skin color from non-skin tones at this point. And I'm also adding more details around the knee before I move brighter on the upper leg highlights. Then I'm going back to the brighter mix and reinforce the line detail, taking the existing ones and basically highlighting them as if they were sculpted detail. Using our skin color mix, I highlight the parts of the upper leg that got a bit too dark. Notice the orientations of the brush strokes that align with the shape. They end up rather opaque and also mimic the fur texture we did on the upper orange parts. Part of what makes well-painted miniatures interesting, it's the extra detail put in that isn't sculpted. Around the knee, I'm adding extra detail like lines before I go back to defining the upper leg highlights. One thing that I did not film for whatever reason, but I wanted to add a thin glaze of pure Mephiston red to the knee to make the colors more saturated and to blend everything more together. Notice how that area compares to before I added the glaze. Adding another layer of highlights to the upper leg, mixing the skin tone mix with more ice yellow, carefully dabbing on lines in a narrow area. Again, highlights like these should not cover too much space. And notice again the steps. Building the main highlight, making sure it's opaque, and then fading out and smoothing the transitions with thinner glazes. I keep doing the same thing until all shapes of the leg were highlighted. Going back to the black parts. By now you have probably realized that I don't really focus on one area and finish that. I guess it could be viewed as a bad habit and it breaks the flow of tutorials like these. I'm sorry, but to me it doesn't make sense to work on an area until it's done and then realizing it might have to be redone after because of something we don't like. I like to gradually build all elements and see how they work together and influence each other before I finalize them. Notice that I still have not applied the final highlights on the upper body either, for example. I define the shapes of the black parts. Can you name the steps by now? Try to spot the sketching, defining, and the unification process. Now and then I also add additional structure like these lines on areas that would look too boring if we only worked with the sculpted detail we had. On the calf you can see again how I blend the highlight and the lower layer together. I'm mixing in more ice yellow for the highlights. I like to use a global highlight color, meaning I will use the same highlight colors for warmer and cooler parts of a miniature to draw everything together more. The areas read as most gray now, so I want to add pure black to the shadows, and I'm doing that by using a rather opaque black color and dabbing, stippling and lining it into the shade areas. Now that this part is done, I can go back to the orange parts and apply the final highlights. I want you to look at how I define the shapes once again. I only shade the areas that curve in and downwards, and also look at where I put the highlights on more exposed areas like the biceps. Notice the defining bright outlines. Bringing up all the higher up areas to an overall brighter situation, like on the shoulder here, it makes no sense that there would be very dark shadows on an exposed area like this. You can look at the features from above and everything you see would catch light from a global zenithal light source. That's a good rule of thumb. Stippling on opaque highlights, smoothing out the transitions of the highlights. And the brighter the highlights, the less area they cover, as always. At this point I have a good idea about how I want to define the shapes, and I can move faster and more confident with my brush strokes, and it's all about building up that contrast. See how just using the transparency and varying the number of layers that cover one area builds highlights and gradients. It takes me a few layers to get where I want to be. Again, you can move faster here, but be aware that the more layers you use, the smoother the blend will appear. This is up to you. Want to move faster? Use less in between layers. Let's talk again about volumetry and take the biceps for example. I'm putting in lines where it integrates with other muscles. That way we pronounce the shades on the adjacent volumes because of contrast enhancement effects. I'm doing the same on the triceps back here. This is a step away from more traditional ways of painting that use washes to define shades. But washes just settle equally in all recesses through the laws of gravity. They don't care about where our light source is coming from, but we can actively define it with layers of paint and by pronouncing higher up areas, no matter if they are next to a recess or not. This doesn't mean we have to completely ditch washes, and I'm going to show you in the later parts of the video how to apply washes and get good results. Now and then I'm mixing in between colors for areas that I highlighted too much. Because of the more hunched over pose of the Myrmidon, the chest muscles do not face straight up like they would if he were standing more upright. So I want the lower parts to be darker. I put a few transparent layers of darker shade over the area. You see that this step also makes transitions smoother as I do that up on the deltoid. You can do this anytime if you feel like your transitions are too rough as well. Just unify your layers with this and build your highlights back up. We can also use this color to make a few areas that are in the shadows but would catch a bit more light brighter. Finally, I use pure ice yellow to put in the final highlights. This adds a maximum of contrast, but should of course be reserved for very confined areas and culminating reflections, like points on spherical objects and thin lines on more cylindrical shaped volumes, as well as edges. With the highlights done, I went on to put in the shades and shadows. Again, I don't want to add any additional colors, so I use the ones I already have on the miniature. I have a mix of Mephiston red and dark sea blue on the palette, into which I mix a portion of the orange brown. This gives a nice saturated red brown. And just like with highlighting, I'm applying the shade colors in an opaque way in the deepest areas and then fade them out into the midtones, pushing the dark pigments away from the brighter parts into the darker areas. Notice again how more layers of transparent paint stacked on each other creates gradients. Using this color not only shades our Myrmidon and increases contrast, it also adds back overall saturation that we lost a bit with the naturally desaturated highlights. Just like we painted the highlights on features facing up, we use exactly the same techniques for shading, adapting our opaqueness of color to the situation. We can just put an opaque layer of paint into the deepest area and use more transparent layers to create transitions to the midtones. Now it's time to create an overall darker light situation in areas like under the arms where less light would be on the miniature. And we also defined that we would make the lower parts of the miniature darker so the focus is more on the upper body, and this shading ties right in with that premise. While I make sure not to cover the highlights on the areas that would still catch light, I'm gradually shading down the shadow areas with thin layers of paint. It's a gradual process, slow but really controlled, and I like that. Even on higher areas up on the miniature where the overall light situation is brighter, we have areas that would be in shadow, like the massive neck muscle, and we have to shade accordingly. If you took a picture with just a black base coat and light from above for reference, you would see a deep black shadow there. Areas facing straight down, I'm just shading right away with more opaque layers, and I also darkline areas beneath features that would cast a hard shadow. Everything facing down receives shading, and I'm applying more transparent layers to the areas I want to darken overall. These transparent layers allow for a gradual change in value without ruining the gradients we established before. They just darken everything. On the back, I'm using this color to shade, but also to unify and gradually bring together the upper and lower parts. It takes a few layers to darken an area significantly, but again, the transparency of each individual layer is what makes a flexible tool to create gradients. Just applying layer after layer and leaving each one to dry and applying more layers where I want the orange to be darker. For the deepest shadow, I'm adding more dark sea blue. Shadows have this tendency to look a bluish cool shade, and we can exaggerate this a bit. And I'm putting these shades in more precisely and controlled. The increased amount of dark sea blue in the mix adds a cooler shade to our shadows and increases the credibility of our shadows both through increased contrast and the more realistic, cool shadow color itself. And again, you can see I'm adapting the brush strokes and application of color to what is needed, either more confined stippling or broader brush strokes and so on. Mixing a brighter shade of this color, leaving out the dark sea blue to bring out higher areas in the shaded areas, like this ribcage muscles. And using this brighter color, I'm also defining some lines where two shapes meet, like under the arm here. Adding a bit of ice yellow, I'm putting in the highlight steps on these features. I'm making the lower part of the latissimus a bit brighter to set it apart from the very dark parts under the arm. We could consider this like a bounce slide from the ground and even paint it in a color that we would find in the base. I also decided to shade the hands more, to be in line with the rest of the figure. Mixing the brown color I use to shade the rest of the orange, again I'm adding transparent layers and I make sure the pigment accumulates in deeper areas. That way features like the knuckles get pronounced. I think this process shows the potential of controlled washes nicely. So whenever you're using washes, make sure they go where you want them to go and to be in line with your light situation. That's it for the skin video. It's not possible to show each and every brush stroke in a video like this, but you should have learned the general principles and be able to repeat and apply them on all of the skin. In the next video I'm going to show you how I did the face. Don't forget to leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you're new and activate the notifications via the bell to not miss the next part. If you want to see the videos 1 week earlier, consider joining my Patreon, like these guys already have. And if you want to do me a favor, just watch one of my other videos, like the ones suggested on screen.